we come to the very final division of the final division of OT Intro, that being the third category of the writings. Of course, the writings are the final of the three divisions of the Hebrew canon: the law, the prophets, the writings of the hagiographa. And that subsequently is divided up into the poetical books, to the Megillah, and finally to the historical books, which in our version are 5: Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, First Chronicles, Second Chronicles. 5 in our version: Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, 1 through Chronicles. 3 in the Hebrew Bible by drawing together Ezra, Nehemiah, and First and Second Chronicles. Okay, Daniel comes right after Ezekiel. It would look as if he begins, of course, the minor prophets, but just like I said, he doesn't. He's not found in the prophets. He's found in the writings. So it's in a little difficult place as far as the Hebrew canon is concerned, because it would lead us to the inclination that Daniel would perhaps be somewhere in between the major and the minor prophets. He's shorter than any of the major, but he's far longer than any of the minor, which would put him right in between, which is where he is in our version, Daniel the prophet, between Ezekiel, and of course Hosea comes after him. Okay, the prophet's name, Daniel, first of all, you can see that his name ends with an E-L. And this is one of several names of God in the Old Testament. El, simply E-L, El. Most of the places where you find it, it's going to have some reference to God, especially when you've got some type of contraction in the name of an Old Testament person, such as in the case of Daniel. So you know that his name has to have something about God in it, because God is what ends his name. You can tell what the beginning of it is by going back to Genesis chapter 30, and we can find out without knowing any, well, you've got to know some Hebrew, you've got to know what El means, but without that, you wouldn't know anything. With that, you can turn back to Genesis chapter 30, and you remember the 12 sons of Jacob, or 11 that he has at this time. Benjamin's born at a later time. One of them in Genesis 30 and verse 6 happens to be known as Dan. And generally, the people are named after some event, after some caricature of themselves. Rachel said, God hath judged me. This is an event, an historical event. God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan, which means judging. So you add Dan to El, you've got Dan-E-L, Daniel. God is my judge, is what the name Daniel means. God is my judge. Now, this is not only one of the biblical names. Of course, you'll find a lot of people today. You don't find that many named by some of the other Old Testament prophets' names, but Daniel is a popular name today. If you'll look on your chart, we can find out something about the length of Daniel's ministry, because it happens to be the longest of all the prophets. Now, he's not among the prophets as far as his book is concerned, but as far as his ministry is concerned, he's called by Jesus, at a text at which we'll look in a moment, a prophet. So we know that he's a prophet. He just didn't have his work classified among the prophetical works. Why? We'll discuss that in a few moments. But on the bottom of your chart, you can see that Daniel and his ministry extend from the first captivity, 605 B.C., all the way down until the end of the 70-year period of Babylonian captivity, 536 which, of course, is a 70-year period, which gives Daniel a ministry of around 70 years, which puts him at the top of the list as far as length is concerned among the Old Testament prophets. Now, you can see this in Daniel's book from chapter 1, in verse 1. The 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, notice very carefully that Daniel's book says nothing about Jerusalem falling, because it doesn't fall for several decades. It's just that verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Remember over in chapter 5, if you've read ahead in Daniel, these vessels of the Lord's house become very important in the reign of Belshazzar, who is a subsequent king in Babylon, evidently some descendant, a near relative of King Nebuchadnezzar. All right, that puts it back to first captivity. Remember, there's 3, 606, 605, 597, 586. Then when you turn to Daniel, well, let's see, right there in the same chapter, as a matter of fact, the last verse, Daniel continued even unto the 1st year of King Cyrus, which is around 539, 538 B.C. This is when Babylon falls to the Medes and the Persians, which we'll read about over again in chapter 5, the end of chapter 5, and the reign of Belshazzar. Don't confuse now the two names Belshazzar and Belteshazzar. Daniel was renamed the Babylonian name Belteshazzar. But, of course, Bel is one of the Babylonian gods, and that's why they named him that. But one of the kings of Babylon, chapter 5, is Belshazzar, 2 different individuals, Daniel and King Belshazzar. But then what I was going to turn to was over to Daniel chapter 9, and verse 1. You see where it says in 121, Daniel continued even to the 1st year of King Cyrus. It really corresponds to the 1st year of Darius, although, of course, Cyrus had been ruling for quite some time. It is speaking of his ruling with respect to his ruling over Babylon, which he didn't do in 550 B.C., although he was still king then. It came at a later time. The 1st year of Darius, Daniel chapter 9, verse 1. The 1st year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, which was king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the 1st year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books the number of the years, according to the word of the Lord, which came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. Now, you wouldn't have to know that from chapter 1 and the 3rd year of Jehoiakim until the 1st year of Cyrus was 70 years, because he already tells you that here in chapter 9 and verse 2. He gives you the length of time, 70 years. And furthermore, over in chapter 10, in verse 1, it shows us that Daniel really continued not only to the 1st year of Cyrus, but all the way to the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar, had this thing revealed unto him. All of this points to the fact that Daniel lived to be a ripe old age, somewhere in the vicinity of 90, which means he would have been somewhere in the vicinity of 20 when he came over in 605 in the first captivity, which gives him a rather extended prophetic ministry of 70 years. Corresponding to Jeremiah's prophecy over in Jeremiah 25, that they would be in captivity for 70 years. One of the few that, of course, lived through the whole period is Daniel. Who is another one that I said that there are indications in the Scripture that he probably lived during the whole captivity? Haggai, right, because Haggai, remember, is the older of the two post-exilic prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, because his name's always mentioned first. And in Zechariah chapter 2, Zechariah is called a young man. Whenever the angel says, go and speak to this young man, you've got the angel with the measuring rod in Zechariah 2 and verse 1, and down in verses 3 and 4, it refers to Zechariah as a young man, which would place, and of course he prophesies 2 months after Haggai, which would place Haggai as the older of the prophets. And Haggai says in his book, who among you has seen the glory of the former temple? because of all the turmoil that the people were going through because of the relatively diminutive size of Zerubbabel's temple, which means that Haggai, if you got all of that down, you should already know it. That's why I'm not pausing and saying point 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, D, which means that Haggai would have been at least from 586 all the way till the end of the captivity. Not necessarily to 606, but there is that possibility. All right, from Daniel chapter 1, we see that Daniel was of royal blood. Who was one of the important minor prophets that we showed you from the first verse of his book that was of royal blood? Zephaniah. How come? Who is his great-great-grandfather? Hezekiah. Spelled Hizkiah in Zephaniah 1 verse 1. That's what's unusual. You see, the more you go in this, the more you'll remember all this, and if you stay with the same Bible that you have, which I always do, then you can have it all memorized where it is on the page. And I know where Zephaniah 1, it's down here on the left-hand page, the left-hand corner, the bottom of the page. And that way you'll remember right where Zephaniah 1:1 is, and you can see it in your mind. There, he goes through 4 generations. And we pointed out to you in that message, that's what's unusual. Why go back through 4 generations unless that 4th one, not the 3rd or the 2nd one, but the 4th one is some significant figure among the Jews. Now here in Daniel 1, verses 3 and 4, we have the inclination that Daniel, perhaps along with his 3 friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were of seed royal. The king, this of course is Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel 1:3, spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom there was no blemish, but well-favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science. How do you like that? They understood science then. That's what got them lifted up. He must have known some things about science. And such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, which means they must be used to the royal procession and the pomp that goes on in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans, which means they were bright, intelligent, young men, not children. That's a poor translation. It simply refers to a young individual, and it's certainly not a 3-year-old who has a lot of knowledge in science. Skillful in wisdom, cunning in knowledge, and so forth. They would have to refer to young men. 4 of these, of course, are mentioned, and 4 of these become important in the book. Verse 6, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, whose names are changed, of course, to Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all 4 of which names are Babylonian pagan names, and generally the church of our day only knows Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah by their Babylonian pagan names of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Nothing wrong with that, but it's interesting that they'll call them by their Babylonian names, but call Daniel by his Hebrew name. Why not call Daniel Belteshazzar? Except that most people in your average denominational church never heard of Belteshazzar before. They've heard of Daniel. You see, about the only thing that people in the church of our day know about Daniel are the 3 Hebrew children in the fiery furnace and Daniel in the lion's den. And that's about all they know about the book of Daniel. They don't know anything about chapter 2, which is one of the most important chapters in the book. You've got Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the great colossal figure, a head of gold and breast and arms of silver and belly and thighs of brass and legs and feet of iron and the toes of part iron and part clay. Well, they don't know anything about that. But they know about all Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego got cast into the fiery furnace and God delivered them. And they know about Daniel going down in the lion's den and getting delivered. But they don't know about the ram and the he-goat over in chapter 8. And that's more important than Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because all that is a historical fact that really doesn't concern us today, except give us an example of what God will do for those who have faith. But that's what it really boils down to, a historical story that we can base some faith upon, but it doesn't give us the revelation that chapters 2, 7, 8, and 12 do. They're the important chapters in the book of Daniel. All right, did I get through reading them? Yes. Verse 3, children of Israel of the king's seed. Daniel's historicity is confirmed in several texts. First of all, over in Ezekiel, same text, of course, that we use for Job. Ezekiel 14:14 and 14:20. Now you may want to turn here because these are problem passages in most of your Old Testament critical writings that you might read. Why? Well, it is thought to be very unusual by critical scholars that Ezekiel would be classing someone as young as Daniel. Now remember, Ezekiel's 30 when he gets into the ministry, so Ezekiel's going to be older than Daniel would be. And it's thought to be rather strange that Ezekiel would be classifying this obscure royal child that's in Babylon now, Daniel, with two of the greats of the Old Testament, Noah and Job. And besides that, how would Ezekiel have even known Daniel? Babylon is, of course, a huge realm and a huge kingdom. Now, Daniel's in the king's court, Ezekiel is not. Ezekiel is prophesying among the exiles in Babylon, and they think it's a little difficult to believe that he actually would have recorded Daniel's name, writing here twice, as a matter of fact, with Noah and with Job. Consequently, generally it's felt that this Daniel is a Daniel, you leave out the I, D-A-N-E-L, from the epic of Rosh Shamra. I don't know if we've mentioned that before, but it was a famous Ugaritic text that was discovered, the epic of Rosh Shamra, that mentions a certain historical figure known as Daniel, D-A-N-E-L. And so most of them will say that the Daniel here is not the Daniel of the Bible. Though these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they should deliver but their own souls, speaking of Jerusalem, by their righteousness, saith the Lord God. And verse 20, though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, as I live, saith the Lord God, they shall deliver neither son nor daughter, they shall but deliver their own souls by their righteousness. Well, we could turn it around and say it would be even more strange that Daniel, an unknown figure except from some epic of Rosh Shamra, would have been put side by side with Noah and Job. Amen. It would only make sense that it would be the great Daniel that the Jews and that Christians know of from the Old Testament, rather than some obscure Ugaritic figure from the epic of Rosh Shamra. The Noah we know from Genesis, the Job we know from his book, but the Daniel, we don't know him from the Bible. He's not in the Bible. The Bible's simply not going to pick a figure like that out for their piety's sake without them being some important historical Old Testament figure, which Daniel proved to be. Does it have to mean that he had reached his height of glory by the time Ezekiel said something about him? But after all, remember that Daniel did go up in rank very quickly because of the favor that God had on his life. Amen. So it certainly would seem reasonable that the three figures that we have there are three figures from Old Testament history: Noah, Daniel, and Job. Then over in the New Testament, let's see, we won't turn there yet. I've got it down to turn in a moment, but Matthew 24:15. We'll turn there in a few moments. Now let's go into some of the critical problems with Daniel's book. I've just got some of the major ones down. First of all, these are some of the problems as far as Daniel and his date. Now, of course, obviously we're dating him around 605 B.C. When we give you the dates of the prophets, it's the date of the beginning of their ministry. So for Daniel, it would be 605 B.C., which is way too early, according to the critics. Why? Because of the following problems that they found in the book. First of all, they found errors in the history, the knowledge of history of the 6th century B.C. in Daniel's book. What those were, we're not going to go into, but they have said they found some historical erroneous statements made in Daniel's book concerning the 6th century B.C. Now, if Daniel is writing during the 6th century B.C., then he's not going to make any historical mistakes. He was living right in the time period of the 6th century B.C., so certainly he would have been correct and knowledgeable in all the events that were transpiring there. Amen. Now, if he wrote several hundred years later, which of course is what the critical school holds about the book of Daniel, then perhaps he got a little confused on his details, because after all, that's several hundred years before his time. So that's how they reason around in a circle and end up with a circle of zero, as far as any understanding about the book is concerned. Then secondly, the presence of Greek words in the book. Babylon is the nation ruling the world at the time. Greece doesn't come on the scene until the end of the 4th century B.C. So if we've got Greek words in the book, it must mean the book was written sometimes during the Greek period of domination in the world. What other book have we looked at in another connection that had Greek words in it? Well, that was one, but I'm thinking of another one. Right along with Ezra, though. Nehemiah. Yeah, Nehemiah. We studied that in biblical literature. You found some Greek words there. And by the way, remember, Ezra and Nehemiah are later than Daniel. So it's greater a problem now when we go back as far as Daniel. Now, the Greek words in particular fall in chapter 3, verse 5, with this list of musical instruments. Now, there are other examples, but particularly in Daniel 3:5, where Nebuchadnezzar has set his great image of gold up in the plain of Dura, and he said that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, the languages, fell down and worshipped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Now in this list, especially in verse 5, the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and the dulcimer, most of those are Greek words for Greek musical instruments. Yet we're several centuries before the time of Alexander the Great's conquest of the world. So that's another critical problem. Thirdly, the literary features of Daniel's book. I'm really not going to go into answering all these. I'll maybe answer them some other time. Fourthly, and these last three that I'm going to give you here are the major problems they have. Fourthly, Daniel's book exhibits a very detailed post-exilic theology, according to critical scholars. A detailed post-exilic theology, especially in the following areas. In the area of angels, Daniel's book is filled with angels. And angels become more prominent during the time of the writing of the Apocrypha, where you even have new angels that aren't in the Old Testament mentioned. And since this is the time where you've got such an emphasis on angelology in Judaism, then some say Daniel's book would have to have been written during or around the same time period because of his many allusions to angels. Another example is his teaching on judgment. Another is especially Daniel's several references to bodily resurrection. Critical scholars claim that is strictly a New Testament revelation, a New Testament knowledge and understanding. The Old Testament saints had no idea of a bodily, physical resurrection. Because remember, you laugh at that, but that's a profound thought to have. That once the body ceases to live, then what happens to the person if there's really a person there besides the body? Because all we know from observation is the body. And when the body ceases, then the person ceases. But yet to Daniel, that's not true. That just because the body ceases doesn't mean the person ceases, but the person still exists somewhere. And what's more than that, at the end times, the body is going to be raised again and either joined with a person or it's going to turn into a person again. That's a profound thought for anyone to have. We as Christians would never have gotten that anywhere outside of the Scriptures. I remember, I'm reminded right now of the teaching we did a long time ago from Acts chapter 4. I believe that was the chapter where we dealt with in the first few verses on the subject of the resurrection. And that's one thing the Pharisees and Sadducees hated to hear, was that Jesus had raised from the dead and ascended back to the Father. Because resurrection like that shows that someone is a greater spiritual authority than you are, that can die and that can come back to life again and live in a greater power than they had before they died. So that's really exciting, and Daniel's book does contain references to bodily physical resurrection. But the critics say it's too early, though, because we don't really find bodily resurrection taught explicitly until we get to the Apocrypha. And that much of it is true. We don't have whole teachings on the bodily resurrection in the Old Testament, but we do have references to it. One of your memory verses will be one of those texts in Daniel that speaks of the bodily resurrection. All right, another example here under his detailed post-exilic theology is his teaching on the culmination of the ages. Furthermore, his teaching on Satan and the Antichrist. And a whole lot of other subjects. But notice that it gets into end-time events, and they say it's too early for Daniel to have all of this already revealed to him. Okay, another one of the critical problems, and this we might say is the major one, is all of chapter 11 of the book. You'll turn over there for a moment. The critical date puts Daniel around 167 B.C. during the Maccabean time period. And notice that is centuries after when we're dating Daniel. 605, we're dating him. The critical date is universally 167 B.C. during the Maccabean time period. Why? Basically, you can put all the other reasons on the shelf, basically because of chapter 11. Because critical as well as conservative scholars recognize from Daniel 11 that whoever's writing this, whether it's the Daniel that we know that lived during the time of Nebuchadnezzar or one that lived during the Maccabean time period, has a detailed account of the reigns of the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic Greek kings. And this is explained here in chapter 11. The kingdom of the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. Now the angel is speaking here. And now I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. Well, he's talking about Cambyses, Pseudo-Smyrnus, and Darius Hystaspes. They're known from history. And the 4th shall be far richer than they all. Who's the 4th one? Who comes after Darius the first Hystaspes? Well, go back to your chart if you don't know. It says the 4th one will be far greater. You've got them all listed right there in your chart, and yet Daniel's prophesying this long before they were ever even born. If his true date is 605. If it's 167, he's reading some records of history, and that's how we got them down. You've got Cyrus, then after that, Cambyses, you've got Pseudo-Smyrnus, Darius the first Hystaspes, and the 4th, who's far greater and richer than they all, is Esther Ahasuerus, known as Xerxes by the Greeks. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. Remember the battles of Salamis and Thermopylae Pass and Marathon, where he was defeated, Xerxes, whenever he went against the Greeks. And that's just what it says, and he will stir up the realm of Greece. And that's what he does. And a mighty king shall stand up, Alexander the Great, who comes next, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. Then on down to verse 5. And the king of the south, which would be a Seleucid king, a Ptolemaic king, the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion, and his dominion shall be a great dominion. And in the end of years they shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south, the Ptolemaic king, shall come to the king of the north, the Seleucid king, to make an agreement. And that really did happen in Ptolemaic Seleucid history. But she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall he stand nor his arm. But she shall be given up, that is the king's daughter, and they that brought her, and he that begat her, and he that strengthened her in these times. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army, and shall enter into the fortresses of the kings of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. And shall also carry captives into Egypt, their gods with their princes, and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold, and he shall continue more king of the north, that is the king of the south. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom, and shall return into his own land, but his son shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces. And it just goes on and on and on about the king of the north and the king of the south.
For the continuation,
but his son shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of great forces. And it just goes on and on and on about the king of the north and the king of the south. And if Daniel's writing from 167 B.C., he could look back and piece all this together from history. But if he's writing from 605, how in the world did he get all these details? About the marriage of one king's daughter to another king, and that gave him peace for a while, and then a root came up from the arm of the king's daughter. And then you've got the king of the south reigning more and longer than the king of the north. But then when the king of the south gets back, then his sons stir up. And you've got back and forth conflicts between the king of the south, the Ptolemies, and the king of the north, the Seleucids, and Daniel is portraying all this very graphically for us. And that's, as I say, a chief critical problem with Daniel's writings. And then finally, Daniel's place in the Hebrew canon. Daniel's not placed among the prophets. He's placed in the writings. Now, according to the critical dates that they themselves have established, the prophets, the canon of the prophets, there was a threefold canon. The law, it was opened and closed. Afterwards, the prophets were opened and closed. And then afterwards, the writings were opened and closed. And the prophetic canon of the Old Testament was closed, according to them, around 250 B.C. So they say, why wasn't Daniel's book among the prophets? Because Daniel wrote sometime after 250 B.C. Because had he written before, they would have included his writings in the canon of the prophets rather than among the hagiographa. But since he's prophesying 167, he came after the close of the canon of the prophets. Now we'll study more about that in our class in biblical literature, because all those dates, of course, of theirs are false. There was not a threefold canon where you've got the opening of one and then the closing and then the opening of the prophets and finally the opening of the writings. There was simply one Old Testament canon, although we've got several different divisions. And not always do we have the same threefold division. Because remember, Jesus many times in the Gospels, like in Matthew 5, refers to the Old Testament as the law and the prophets. And he says nothing about the writings. It's because at one time that's how they were classified, the law and the prophets. But when you get over to Luke 24, then he does classify them in a threefold manner: the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, the largest book of the writings, standing for the hagiographa. All right, we're not going to even try to answer those problems. That would take too much time. We'll study that some other time. But since we're on this last critical reason that they hold for Daniel being written around 167, he's not been placed among the prophets, but he's been placed among the writings. Let's just quickly deal with that. Why was Daniel's book placed among the writings rather than among the prophets? Now for this we have to turn to our text of Matthew 24:15. Matthew 24:15. It's one of those important verses to be familiar with. How do we know it's one of those important ones? Because Jesus says that it is at the end of the verse. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, then whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, those on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house, and neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. Now, the interesting thing about Matthew 24 and verse 15 is that Jesus himself settles the matter that Daniel was a true historical Old Testament prophet by referring to him as Daniel the prophet. He's not referring to someone as Daniel, the legendary figure in the epic of Rosh Hashanah, or not Daniel who lived during the Maccabean period. Daniel the prophet, the only Daniel the prophet the Old Testament knows anything about, the one who wrote the 12 chapters of our book called after him Daniel. Now Jesus calls him Daniel the prophet, and we know that he's talking about our Daniel because when he talks about the abomination of desolations, that's found in Daniel chapter 9. So it has to be that Daniel. It can't be some other Daniel because he's referring to our book, chapter 9 of the book of Daniel. But since he refers to Daniel as a prophet, then we've got the problem of Daniel not being included with the prophets as far as that portion of the Old Testament canon is concerned. Even though he's recognized by Jesus in the New Testament as an Old Testament prophet, his writings are still not included in the prophets. Why? Let me give you several reasons why. First of all, in the first half of Daniel's book, much of his material deals with historical events and reads so much like a narrative that it's different from the character of what we think of prophetic writings when we read Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Daniel is telling a story in chapter 3 about Nebuchadnezzar setting up a 60-cubit golden image in the plain of Dura, and then when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't fall down and bow before it, he throws them in a burning fiery furnace. That doesn't sound like the writings of a prophet. He's telling a story, an Old Testament story. So that's one of the reasons. You have to put all these together, but that's one why Daniel's book is placed in the writings as opposed to the prophets. Secondly, Daniel's role as a statesman in the Babylonian court many times overshadowed his prophetic ministry, especially again in the first half of the book. His role as a statesman. You see, that's one of the most unique things about Daniel, the way, just like Joseph of Genesis in the Egyptian court, he got raised up to be second in command of all of Babylon. And it extended even after Babylon fell into the Medo-Persian reign, because in end of chapter 6 and beginning of chapter 7, Daniel is still one of the top 3 figures in the Medo-Persian kingdom. So he's a great statesman in the Babylonian and in the Medo-Persian court, and sometimes that tends to overshadow his prophetic role. Now, he's still a prophet, Matthew 24:15, don't forget that. He's still a prophet, but sometimes that prophetic role is overshadowed by his role as a statesman in the 2 heathen courts, Babylon, Medo-Persia. And then finally, of the 2 functions of the Old Testament prophets, namely being a preacher of righteousness and predicting future events, Daniel did practically none of the former of these. The prophets had a twofold calling: to be a preacher of righteousness and to predict future events. And Daniel's ministry is almost exclusively in the latter of these two choices. He's always predicting future events. No problem with that. But where do you ever find Daniel preaching, "Thus saith the Lord, repent or I'll destroy Jerusalem"? It's too late. It's already being destroyed, you know. You don't find him preaching like that at all. He's not a preacher of righteousness. He's a statesman. And because of that, there is a vast difference, dear friends, between Daniel and Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, as well as Hosea to Malachi. Now, they're all prophets. But Daniel is being used more in the capacity of a Babylonian statesman than he is in his prophetic role in many years of his life. Now, when you get to Zephaniah and all the prophets, they are always preaching something. Even Jonah, although Jonah's book is full of historical matter, which Daniel's is likewise, yet his message was, "Yet 40 days and Nineveh destroyed." In Jonah chapter 3, I believe. Yet 40 days and Nineveh destroyed. He's a preacher of righteousness. So are all the others. But Daniel's not. There's a conspicuous absence of any of his moral preaching, ethical preaching, admonitions and denunciations of sinners in Daniel's book that we find in the other writings. Amen. Consequently, we're going to keep his date 605. There's no need to have the 167 date because we don't have to worry about the close of the prophetic canon in 250, and Daniel didn't get included in there, although Matthew 24:15 says he was a prophet. Doesn't matter when he was prophesying. It doesn't matter when the canon of prophets was closed. He still would not be placed in it because his book fits under the writings and not under the Old Testament prophets. Purpose of the book of Daniel. I know a lot about the book of Daniel. So I'm not trying to just give you these critical problems and not deal with them because I don't know about it. I know a lot about the book of Daniel. Back in, as a matter of fact, as long ago as my senior year in high school, my science fair project was drawing the colossal image of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 2, along with the four beasts in chapter 7, along with the ram and the he-goat in chapter 8, and correlating those with historical events. And I got an A on it, too. I knew what I was talking about. Before that, all I had done was, I had won. I didn't win the science fair. I'd won it every year before that with my bird nest and bird egg collection. I had a fabulous bird nest and bird egg collection, and I had birds talking on tapes and all types of things with very unusual nests that you can't get very easily. I ended up with many broken eggs in my mouth, climbing down out of trees when I was a young boy. Yeah. That's the way you rob a bird's nest when you're up high in an old fir tree. I remember this one man, Mr. Gill, they named a street after him in Memphis. Oh, he would shoot you with a shotgun if he caught you in his yard. And so you had to be quiet about the whole thing. You couldn't signal down, "I'm sending some eggs down in a basket" or something. Generally, I have someone with me, and we'd go up together in the tree, and you get up there, 20, 30, 40 feet up in the tree and just fill your mouth with bird eggs. His yard was just full of common grackles and boat-tailed grackles, and they have a large blue egg with black swirls on it. So I'd fill my mouth with those many times. You're coming down out of the tree and you slip, and the branches break your fall on the way down, and the eggs break in your mouth on the way down. But I had always won because I had such a fascinating collection. I didn't win with Daniel 2, 7, and 8 because no one knew what I was talking about, except my Bible teacher, and that's where I got the assignment, and so I got an A. He knew about Daniel 2, 7, and 8, and he didn't. And he happened to be premillennial in his theology, and he happened to believe the same thing in a general sense as I did about Daniel chapters 2, 7, and 8. And so he was quite flabbergasted over the fact that a senior in high school had that much knowledge about Daniel 2, 7, and 8. Didn't win anything at all, though. Anyway, his purpose, Daniel's purpose, the purpose of his book, is to record God's eternal sovereignty in ordering all the events of history, both small and great, and the ultimate fulfillment of his eschatological plan in establishing his kingdom on the earth and to show the succession of the four world Gentile powers from Babylonian captivity to the Messiah's rule during the biblical period known, known as the times of the Gentiles. You need to get all that down because that's really the whole purpose of the book. We've got time to give it again. To record God's eternal sovereignty in ordering all the events of history, both small and great, and the ultimate fulfillment of his eschatological plan in establishing his kingdom on the earth, and to show the succession of the four world Gentile powers from the Babylonian captivity to the rule of the Messiah during the biblical period known as the times of the Gentiles. And what you didn't get then, you can pick up off the tape. Now, if you'll turn over to Luke chapter 21, Jesus gives us a reference in Luke 21:24 to this period which Daniel's book labors to cover. Luke 21:24. To record God's eternal sovereignty in ordering all the events of history, both small and great, in the ultimate fulfillment of his eschatological plan in establishing his kingdom on the earth, and to show the succession of the four world Gentile powers from the Babylonian captivity to the rule of the Messiah during the biblical time period known in Luke 21:24 as the times of the Gentiles. Now, Luke 21:24 ties in completely with Daniel's prophecy, especially Daniel 2:7 and 8. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. So that is a unique time period, biblical reference to a unique time period that Daniel's book, especially chapters 2, 7, and 8, labors to cover. And it's covered in other portions of Scripture, such as in the book of Revelation. But it's a very important time period, it's a very important reference in the Bible to the period known as the times of the Gentiles, which, as I say, spanned the centuries from the Babylonian captivity to the messianic rule of Christ. That is, on the earth, not his rule in the saints' hearts with his first advent, but the rule on the earth in his second advent. An outline of the book. Daniel chapter 1 is an historical introduction. It's difficult to divide, but we'll take 2 through 7, God's historical plan from Nebuchadnezzar to Darius. That is, in its unveiling, it covered the period from Nebuchadnezzar to Darius. But it covers in fulfillment the period from Nebuchadnezzar until the second advent. And then chapters 8 through 12. 1, then 2 through 7, then 8 through 12. Here we've got a series of prophetic visions and revelations concerning the end times. Now, Daniel is the apocalypse of the Old Testament, on the same level that Revelation is the apocalypse of the New Testament. Daniel, as far as his teaching on end-time events, is the most important Old Testament book, superseding even the prophecies of Isaiah Ezekiel, and Zechariah. Now, although Daniel does have a lot of historical information, like him being in the lion's den, and Nebuchadnezzar setting up his 60-cubit stature of whatever golden image in the plain of Dura, although it does contain these things, Daniel's book is extremely important because of its teaching on end-time events. Now, if you'll turn to chapter 2, one more comment before we do that. Chapter 2, 4b. This is unique about Daniel's book. We just soon go ahead and get it on tape, although we've said it before. Daniel 2, 4b through 7:28. It's not written in Hebrew, it's written in Aramaic, which is very unique. Why? Well, we'll probably cover that whenever we cover Daniel's book sometime. But in Daniel 2 and verse 4, we read, "Then spake the Chaldeans to the king of the Syriac." But Syria was only one of the city kingdoms of the Arameans, so really it should be the Aramaic or the Aramean language. Beginning with, "O king, live forever, tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation." We have Aramaic starting in the book, and it goes through the end of chapter 7, which is verse 28. That's why I've given you the division that I did in the outline, chapters 2 through 7, even though chapters 7 and 8 are talking about the same thing. I divided between 7 and 8 because 7, along with all the preceding chapters back until 2:4b is written in Aramaic, whereas chapter 8 is written in Hebrew, so something must be changing. Daniel must mean for us to get some point, or he wouldn't have changed languages, gone from Aramaic back to Hebrew. And since he changes the language, then we know that he's trying to get across an important point. Now, as I say, back to chapter 2 and verse 31. This is the beginning of Daniel's important end-time teaching. Now, how many of you before have heard us teach the book of Daniel? Well, it's fewer than I thought. Daniel 2:31. Daniel is so important, as I said about Zechariah, we'll teach it sometimes separately, because there's no way, no possible way, no feasible way that you could ever say in Old Testament introduction what needs to be said about the book of Daniel, because it is extremely important on its teaching concerning the tribulation period and the Antichrist, and concerning the covenant that the Antichrist makes with Israel, and concerning the breaking of that covenant, and concerning the various time periods that extend beyond the tribulation. You've got a 30-day period rather than 1,203 score. You go to 1,290. And then you go to 1335, which takes you 75 days beyond. And you've got a lot of different time periods here in Daniel's book that are very important because we're living during what Daniel's prophesying here. And you have to know how long the tribulation period is, and just because the tribulation ends, what happens then? Daniel tells us there's still some leftover things that have to be done after the tribulation period. And I don't know of anybody that really knows anything about that except Daniel, because Daniel records it in his book. "Thou, O king, sawest, and behold a great image. And this great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee. And the form thereof was terrible. And this image's head was of fine gold, breast and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and feet and toes," you get later on in the chapter, "part iron, part clay. Thou sawest till a stone was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet that were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then was the iron, the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broke into pieces together, and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them, and the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and filled the whole earth." This is the dream, and Daniel says, "I'll tell you the interpretation," which he goes on to do. Then you look over in chapter 7. Verse 2. Daniel says, I saw the four winds of the heaven, and they strove on the great sea. What sea is that? Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee, Mediterranean? The four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. The first like a lion, the second like a bear, the third like a leopard, the fourth in verse 7, all he knows how to describe it by is a dreadful one and terrible and strong exceedingly. You see, he gave names to the first three, the lion, the bear that had 3 ribs in its mouth raised up on one side, and then the leopard that had 4 wings, and his wings caused him to fly swiftly. But when he gets to the fourth one in verse 7, he says there's no description. He was dreadful and terrible and strong exceedingly. That's generally what that beast is called, the dreadful, terrible, strong, exceedingly beast. And it had great iron teeth. I could talk so fast about Daniel, I could leave even the best of shorthand writers in here. That's how familiar I am with his book. And it had great iron teeth, devoured, brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts before it, and it had 10 horns. Now I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them a little horn. Then you go down to the scene set where you've got the Ancient of Days in verse 9. Then later on in the chapter you get the interpretation. Chapter 8 and verse 3 picks up the subjects of 2 and 7. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had 2 horns. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. In other words, the lower one came up before the higher one did. And I saw the ram pushing everywhere except eastward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. And as I was considering, behold, a he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes, and he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. How would you like to have a vision like that?
Glory.
That's an end-time vision. Then in chapter 9, well, I could read 8:14 on the way there. He said unto me, unto 2,300 days, and then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. What does the 2,300 days refer to? Daniel 9 and verse 24, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people. Verse 25, know therefore from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem to the Prince the Messiah will be 7 weeks, and then 62 weeks along with that, and the street shall be built again, and the wall shall be built even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. The people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. And unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he will cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. Chapter 11, verse 36, just pointing out the great end-time portions. The king shall do according to his will, and shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper until the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. But, verse 44, tidings out of the east and from the north shall trouble him. He shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. Daniel 12, all end-time prophecy. The last verse, a memory text. Go thy way until the end be. You'll rest and stand in your lot at the end of days. Bodily resurrection. Well, Daniel's book is an exciting one. Very difficult to interpret, though, because of the much symbolism and imagery that he provides in his book. But much of what you've got in Revelation now has been taken on the basis by John the Apostle of what Daniel the prophet had said in his book, as well as Ezekiel, but especially of what you find in Daniel the prophet's book. A lot of Paul's writings regarding in 2 Thessalonians 2, the man of sin, the son of perdition. 1 John and 1 John 2 and 1 John 4, the Antichrist, has been taken out of the prophecies of the prophet Daniel. I'd have to say it's probably one of the most exciting books in all the Bible, which would include the New Testament as well. But as I say, we'll teach that sometime separately in the future. All right, we'll stop with Daniel and his promise that he'll rise again in the last days. Daniel 12:13.
And what do they do with him talking about being in Nebuchadnezzar's?
Well, I was asked that several years ago back when we were a visitor, I remember, over at the other building. Question is, what do they do with the critics if they're going to date it 167 with Daniel being in Nebuchadnezzar's court? Well, the author of the book is not talking about himself. He's writing about some other figure who lived back then. It doesn't matter, that there was a figure that lived back then named Daniel that was in Nebuchadnezzar's court, but we can't have him the author of the book because he knows too much about future events. So that's very easy. Why? You see, if you get the author living 167, he doesn't claim to be the Daniel of the book. He just claims to be another Daniel. And he's giving you all this information that took place prior to his time that went all the way back. He's talking about the fall of the city there, or the first captivity in 605, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim. But he's not saying that he lived then. But the author of the book, the true author, Daniel, does say that he's living at that time. But he also, of course, is giving a lot of future revelation, especially in chapter 11. First 20 verses or so of chapter 11 especially.
For a complete